watch Mojo's top 5 facts about communism. You're gonna have an aneurysm at their second fact. Oh, jeez. We've reacted to watch Mojo's top 10 communist videos, and they have Mikhail Gorbachev at like number 2, which obviously Gorbachev is hated by socialists and communists everywhere, and was instrumental in the dissolution of the USSR and the neoliberalization of Russia and the former Soviet countries, which put them in massive poverty and created massive unemployment and allowed drugs and prostitution to flow back over the borders. That's what Gorbachev did, but apparently he's the second best communist according to Watch Mojo. So I'm sure this is a great video. I'm actually against these listing videos in general. I just don't think like top 10 lists or like ranked lists are a good way to look at the world. They're not a good way to analyze the world around us because things don't work like that, right? You can't rank everything in a top 5 list. Everything, every piece of art or everything has things about it that are good and things about it that are bad. Things about it that are good for me and things about it that are good for someone else, or bad for me and good for someone else, right? Things are complex. You can't just rank them. And it's the same with wrestling, the sport I'm involved with. Like, they have rankings, where they rank wrestlers 1 through 20 or whatever. It makes no sense because, I might beat, if I'm the number 3 wrestler, I might beat the number 1 wrestler every time because I have a good style versus his style, but I might lose to the number 2 wrestler. And it's just about stylistic matchups because you can't just fit the world into a Watch Mojo top 10 list. So I think these videos are kind of harmful, and I'll end my rant and just watch the video in a second, but I recommend people check out this video from Hans Georg Moeller called Listicles, top 5 important facts about listicles. And this is a philosopher from Germany, and he basically breaks down the issue with these list videos and seeing the world in like a listed way. Breaks it down in a much better way than I could have, or than I just did there. So check that video out if you're interested. Hans Georg Moeller, Carefree Wandering. It's one of my favorite YouTube channels. All right, let's watch Mojo's top 5 facts about communism.
It's often talked about, but rarely understood. Welcome to Watch Mojo's Top 5 Facts. In this installment, we're counting down our picks for the top 5 most revealing facts about communism. This probably won't be anything new to serious students of history, but for the average person, these facts ought to shine a new light onto the so-called Red Devil. Number 5. Its main principles were established by Karl Marx. 19th century philosopher Karl Marx founded Marxism, a socio-economic system in which class and state are abolished. Its tenets were outlined in the Communist Manifesto, a pamphlet.
Marxism is not a socio-economic system where the state is abolished. Marxism is a lens or a tool for analyzing history. Basically, Marx created the idea of dialectical and historical materialism, although he never called it that. It basically said that you can analyze societies and their development and their political development as well as cultural development by looking at their level of production. By looking at the tools that those societies have created, how they use those tools to interact with nature and produce things that humans need, and how they organize the production of those things and the relations of production. So who's in charge versus who's working. And this is useful for analyzing why things happened in, say, like slavery in America, because it was a different mode of production versus capitalism. So by looking at the slave mode of production and the wealthy slave owners or the resistance against those slave owners from the slaves, you can learn a lot about the American political system at the time, the American culture at the time, racist ideas which have been prevalent in America since that time. All these things by looking at production and by looking at the economy and by looking at how it developed materially over time, historically. And that is Marxism, not a classless socioeconomic system or whatever. That would be socialism and communism would be the names of the systems.
Socio-economic system in which class and state are abolished. Its tenets were outlined in the Communist Manifesto, a pamphlet co-written by Marx and Friedrich Engels that detailed.
That would be communism, then, stateless, classless society. And the main principles of Marxism were laid out in Capital, laid out all over the place, but the Communist Manifesto was more of a political program for the Communist Party at the time. This is what the Communist Party, specifically in where was it? Was in I don't know if they wrote it in Germany or if they were in another country at the time, because Marx and Engels had to hop around, obviously, because the authorities were chasing them. But the main principles of communism aren't necessarily laid out in the manifesto. The manifesto is more of a historical, political pamphlet that does lay out Marx's philosophy briefly. But there's a lot of people who read the manifesto and think they understand Marxism, like, oh, I got it all now, and that is a huge mistake. If you read the manifesto, it's impossible to understand Marxism just from reading it. There's not all the information is in there.
The steps a nation would have to take in order to become self-sustaining. In the 160 plus years since its publication, Marxism has given way to communism and socialism, which are the main political implementations of the Marxist philosophy. Because they are governing systems,
What? What are you talking about? So they said Marxism was the communist manifesto, but then it became communism and socialism. So then why did Marx and Engels name the book the Communist Manifesto? You said communism and socialism came later, and this was Marxism. No, this was a political program for the Communist Party, and communism and socialism, or communist parties and the idea of socialism existed well before Marx and Engels. They just made the idea scientific, came up with historical materialism, the theory of class struggle, a lot of the things that we've been talking about, which are largely included in the manifesto. But that wasn't Marxism as opposed to some socialism and communism which came later. That was just communism. That was a political program for the Communist Party.
The original ideas of Marxism have been tweaked to fit their respective agendas, which is counterintuitive since true Marxism is the absence of government.
No. True Marxism, Marx said that he was analyzing Europe and that socialism and scientific socialism would need to be adapted for each country. That each country has specific and different material conditions, which means their class struggle and their construction of socialism will all look different from each other. Because you need a transitionary stage into this stateless, classless society. And Marx was against anarchists who believed that you could go to this stateless, classless society overnight. He said you need dictatorship of the proletariat where the worker seize control of the state. So this idea that none of these existing socialist countries were truly Marxist because they had governments is ridiculous. If they didn't have governments, the U.S. empire would have overthrown them and made them neo-colonies within like 5 seconds. These countries need governments to organize labor in a different way, to organize socialism, construct communism, and fight against imperialism. And every country is going to look different and be different in the way that they do so.
Due to this mistreatment of ideals, communism has mutated into a brutal dictatorship, while socialism is considered communism's easygoing cousin.
Tuition is free in many of those countries. Excellent. They have excellent childcare, strong retirement benefits. They're often very strongly pro-environment, taking on climate change.
It's still
They blocked Cuba and Venezuela from importing vaccines. They helped the U.S. stop Cubans from getting ventilators so that they can strangle a socialist experiment. We love these wonderful social democracies. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are the best. Who cares how many children they stop from getting their medicine or COVID vaccines? At least they aren't authoritarian dictatorships. Right, Bernie?
But with more safeguards and individual rights.
I guarantee you, these people have never been to a socialist country. I've been to a socialist country.
Right.
We're fine. We're
Right.
great.
Number 4. The Cold War was a result of capitalism and communism clashing. The US and the USSR were allies in World War II. They worked together to take down Hitler, end the Holocaust, and bring temporary peace to Earth. Because Germany, Italy, and Japan were defeated and the majority of Eurasia was in ruins, America and the Soviet Union became the world's superpowers, responsible for cleaning up the residual mess and restoring order to the
The Soviet Union was in ruins too. The Soviet Union had more fighting on their doorstep than almost any other place, or probably, I don't know about infrastructure destruction, because there were a lot of European countries that were destroyed, but 22 million Soviets died in World War II fighting against the Nazis. And tons of their infrastructure was destroyed because they were directly invaded by the Germans, which never happened to the U.S. And what was it called? The McCarthy Plan or whatever? I can't remember what it's called, but the U.S. created a trade deal with their European allies where, the U.S. would funnel money for infrastructure projects into the Western European countries in exchange for military and economic support. So those countries were able to rebuild themselves and help the U.S. Destabilize and threaten the Soviet Union. Whereas the Soviet Union had to rebuild from the war, had to rebuild their infrastructure, and they did quite successfully.
Displaced countries. They shared custody of the remaining war-torn nations, but because of their government's conflicting ideologies, locked horns on how they were to be run.
I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion.
Before you knew it, walls were...
It is because of their conflicting ideologies, the Cold War was, but it was also because of conflicting material interests. The U.S. was launching these horrific, murderous bombing campaigns, wars, and CIA destabilization efforts all around the world, anywhere where socialist movements were popping up. Indonesia, North Korea, Chile, Iran, Guatemala, of course, all these interventions that followed World War II, which were part of the Cold War, which saw the U.S. murdering and torturing millions of people because they considered themselves to be communists. And that was anywhere where the U.S.'s material interests were threatened, including like in Guatemala. Jacobo Arbenz came to power. He wasn't even a communist. He wasn't a communist or a socialist. All he said was the government is going to nationalize some of the United Fruit Company, which was a U.S. company that made tons of money off of cheap Guatemalan labor. And so the U.S. did a coup. The CIA organized a coup and overthrew him, and eventually he was boiled to death in a bathtub. So it's less so the conflicting ideologies, although that was a thing. It was more so the conflicting material interests, because imperialism is an economic system, and that is the system that governs the decisions of the U.S. State Department. And imperialism is less concerned with ideas and more concerned with wealth, with exploiting as much as possible and extracting wealth. And when governments or countries get in the way of exploitation, whether those governments are communist or not, the empire is going to try and destabilize them so they can continue to maximize exploitation.
Were being built, deals were being broken, and countries were being invaded.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
By the late 40s, the two were sworn enemies, and the promise of mutually assured destruction resulted in nearly 50 years of tension. But now they're totally besties. America loves Vladimir Putin. Number 3, the Red Scare turned artists into enemies.
It is necessary to investigate before legislating, but the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly.
Communism is anti-capitalist. The sort of consumeristic bliss that America started vibing on after World War II was completely incompatible with the weird egalitarian austerity that Soviet Russia was rocking. And so communism was vilified.
Why'd they call it austerity? Austerity means neoliberalism. Austerity means less of a social safety net and more capitalism, more wealth inequality.
In American political discourse. Enter Senator Joe McCarthy, who, in the 40s and 50s, manned a witch hunt to find and punish American citizens who were considered pro-communist.
Certainly he can present a bill for such services. After all, we are not communists.
That came to mean anyone who was anti-war, anti-segregation, liberal-leaning, or ideologically different in any way. And of course, who better to negatively influence Americans than artists? So McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee took a special interest in them. A few were jailed, but many more were blacklisted from working in the entertainment industry.
We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine.
These included Hollywood legends like Lloyd Bridges, Orson Welles, and Charlie Chaplin.
I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that.
Number 2, it's idyllic.
So why'd they say that the Cold War turned artists against each other? It didn't turn artists against each other. There was a witch hunt by the U.S. government for any artist who was left-leaning. You know, and Americans, again, we were talking about how we are the most propagandized country on earth, but nobody in our country realizes they're propagandized. Because they look at a thing like that and they're like, oh, I'm sure that has no impact on our media. The fact that the U.S. government was hunting down any left-wing or communist anti-war voice in the media for years and blacklisting them from Hollywood, like, that has a huge effect on propagandizing people and creating an information media bubble that our entire country is trapped within. No, that's not actors turning against each other. That's a witch hunt of different ideas within the American entertainment industry, which, as we were talking about earlier, has become deeply, deeply connected with the U.S. State Department since this time.
Like in theory, but pretty rough in practice. The purest form of communism is without government and
I hate when they call Marxism idyllic in theory, because the idea of Marxism is anti-idealism, anti-utopian socialism. This idea that no, we can't just think up the perfect society. We have to look at what our society is right now in extreme detail and look at the different contradictions in our society and how those can be alleviated, and how we can construct something different out of what we currently have, out of our current material conditions, as opposed to just ideologically thinking about things or doing what liberalism does, right? And just saying, this country stands for freedom of speech, this idea. We stand for freedom and democracy and peace, these abstract concepts that, of course, America has not lived up to since their founding. As we were just talking about, we're the country founded on freedom of speech, yet the government does witch hunts for left-leaning people, you know, in the entertainment industry. It's not freedom of speech. But we don't live up to these ideals, you know, because we don't have a materialist understanding of our society and how we can improve it the same way a country like China does. We have these abstract ideals like freedom and democracy, which we use to justify anything, including imperialist murder and plunder.
money. It is a utopia where everybody works for each other, everybody feeds each other, and everyone is self-governed.
We don't need the government.
It is not a utopia. Marx and Engels wrote a book called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, critiquing utopian socialists and talking about how their version of socialism is not utopian. If I hear anyone say that socialism is utopian again, I'm going to make 8 million copies of those books, and I am going to deliver one to every single house on the planet, so I no longer have to explain this anymore. Thank you.
Telling us how to run our industry.
A person does not have to worry about inequality, poverty, or hunger, as his fellow man will help him out, and in turn, he will help his fellow man, for the greater good of everyone.
Really? That sounds pretty good.
However, no country has ever succeeded in pulling this off, possibly because humans are inherently selfish and greedy.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
Instead, the world has had
Every single socialist country has massively increased standard of living. There was a study by Harold Waitskin comparing the development of socialist countries versus capitalist countries. Socialist countries massively outperform capitalist countries. Look at imperialist czarist Russia, where people were dying of famines and constantly being sent to fight and die in needless wars of expansion by the monarchy, versus the USSR, which abolished illiteracy, took it from like 17% to, something like 83% illiteracy down to 0. Something that was done in basically all communist experiments. China under Mao, their development after the revolution where the Communist Party took power was the fastest increase in life expectancy that's ever been seen in human history. Because when you take control of production, and you take control of production from these capitalist oligarchs who are currently only managing production to produce wealth for themselves, when you take hold of that production and you use it to produce for all of society, you're able to do these things like teach people to read and give people free college and develop all these wonderful things, which have been created by every socialist experiment ever.
Mostly tyrannical regimes under the guise of communism. Regimes where, despite whatever positive things may have come with them, hundreds of millions of civilians starved, were worked to death in labor camps, and were systematically executed in great purges carried out, ironically, for the greater good. Number 1. Communism helped and hurt the civil rights movement in America. In theory, communism believes in racial equality.
Communism did not hurt the civil rights movement. Communists were allies of the civil rights movement through and through, and communists were constantly saying that we need to stop dividing ourselves by race, that we, black and white people, need to team up and fight against the bosses. You know, we need to divide ourselves by class rather than race. And these racist laws only serve to divide the working class and help the ruling class. And communists were staunch advocates for civil rights and fighters against the racist, exploitative American system. And you have great examples of civil rights leaders who were also communists or socialists, like Eugene Debs, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King.
As such, the Communist Party was significant in defending and promoting civil rights for African Americans, lobbying for desegregation, unionized workers, and voting rights. Many African Americans joined the Communist Party. In fact, in the 1940s, one black communist, Benjamin J. Davis Jr., was elected to New York City Council before being ousted and jailed for being a communist. The association with communism eventually hurt the civil rights movement, though. There was a time during the Cold War when anyone who spoke of equality, whether communist affiliated or not, was deemed anti-American.
So everyone's right. It's America. We just can't do it at that unreasonable expense of others.
That isn't communism hurting the civil rights movement. The fact that the U.S. government, as they perpetrated systemic racism, while also perpetrating anti-communism and witch hunts for anybody with left-wing ideas, that government saying that equality is bad does not equal the Communist Party hurting the civil rights movement, as they're in the fight, deeply involved in the struggle for civil rights. That is the U.S. government's fault. That is the fault of the bourgeoisie and the ruling class. It's not the communist fault because they called for equality.
Because that becomes un-American.
Some historians speculate if the Cold War had never happened and the word equality hadn't gotten such a bum rap, civil rights would have been granted a lot earlier.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That is what historians say that, because those historians should be immediately discredited, because they are talking complete idealistic nonsense. You know, this idea that civil rights came because, you know, the morality of American politicians got better, you know. Once American politicians accepted the word equality, that's when we got civil rights. No, we got civil rights because the communists and because black people in this country and because lefties in this country got out in the streets and they fought against the government until the government gave them civil rights. They struggled against the government. It wasn't because all of a sudden politicians, in the goodness of their hearts, began accepting the word equality. Absurd, revisionist, idealistic, liberal history.